Today's episode is being recorded on a different microphone for reasons that I hope will be made apparent throughout the video. Speaking of things that are different, we are going to be talking about climate change. Yay! Alright guys, not doing the fan art section today because I don't want to plug up the beginning of the video too much, but today we're going to be talking about Dr. Jonathan Sarfati and a recent video that was done with him in an interview. But before we get into that, we're going to cut away for just a sec. Hey Gigi. Hey, I know you're not used to seeing me like this close up, but today's a bit of a different thing. I actually got a package from Fifine Technologies. Hi, Gigi. From what they have said, a new microphone of theirs they're wanting me to actually try out. So we're going to go ahead and open this guy up and see what we have inside, and I guess do a review for them. This is going to be new and interesting. All right, let's open this up and see what we have inside. First of all, we have a little social media insert here. Then we have a user manual. Next, we have an actual pop filter. It has a very strong mounting arm here. Let's look under this into the shadow box itself. We have a secondary pop filter, always good to use too when you can. Your audio cable, which is a USB cable, and if you don't have a dedicated audio interface, you want to go with USB because you can get more power to your microphone that way. Very useful, it's a lesson I learned the hard way. Mount, scissor arm. This looks to be about the same build of scissor arm that I use for my microphone. So already with this microphone, you're getting about $20 worth of useful equipment over and above the mic itself. Now for a piece of equipment that I don't actually have, it comes with a shock mount as well, which I say I don't actually have it. I guess I have a shock mount now. I mean, it's physically here. And then finally, the microphone itself, which one thing I will already say about this microphone, it feels good. It's made of metal. It's not made of cheap plastic or anything. The microphone itself is also very compact. It's about the size of my hand, so if you needed a good travel microphone, as long as the quality is good, then this looks like it will actually be a very good travel microphone. So, let's go ahead and give it a shot and see how it tests out. Alright, so this is going to be a test of the audio without any post-production on it. And this part is going to be a test of the audio with post-production. This is versus what most of you are used to, my Blue Yeti. And this is now the Blue Yeti in post-production. And now we are back to the Fifine K780A microphone. As you can tell, both the Blue Yeti and the Fifine actually sound pretty good. And if I had to recommend this microphone to anybody, it would be a great budget microphone or a good secondary travel microphone for anybody who is needing to go out and do podcasts or anything like that. This is a microphone that is very good if you're on a budget. It's only about $50, and it comes with all of the equipment that you need normally that you have to get peripherally with another mic like the Yeti or even the Yeti Snowball that is their budget-priced option. It basically ends up meaning you pay about $20 to $30 for the microphone itself and about $20 to $30 for all the peripheral equipment, all in a bundled package. And this does not sound like a $20 microphone. This definitely sounds like the Yeti Snowball to me. So if you guys have any projects on YouTube or anything that you want, or even, like I said, a secondary travel mic because it is nice, compact, and it comes with a nice shadow box, then I have an Amazon link down below. I don't actually get anything for that, but the company was nice enough to send me the microphone itself, so I'm going to go ahead and be nice enough and send them a link just in case they want to get any more sales on their mic. Anyway, thank you guys for tolerating this plug in the middle of the video. Let's get back to the actual video itself. Alright, sorry about that. I feel like I could have made that shorter, but I've never been asked to do a product review in proper before. I guess there was that one time for a black light, but I don't have much of a use for that. Anywho, like I said before, today we're going to be covering Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. So, let's get into the video itself and see what has to be said.
So welcome to Creation Talk. We've got a good one for you today. We're going to be talking about climate change. Hi, I'm Gary Bates, and I'm here with CMIUS's head scientist, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati.
And he looks really uncomfortable.
G'day.
Jonathan, let me just say that when I look at Genesis 1:28, we creationists call that our dominion mandate. For me personally, I recognize that I'm living in God's creation.
It is indeed.
He made humans the head of it, so much so when we messed it up, he had to do something about it and send Christ. But recognizing that it's God's creation, I actually do think we have a duty of care over creation. It was given for our benefit, to be stewards of it. It's a great resource. We don't want to waste it. We don't want to pollute it unnecessarily.
Two things. First of all, I think that through this video, we're going to find that you're going to be given a lot of excuses to pollute it anyway, but that's just a prediction. The other thing I want to note is that's completely opposite of what I've heard most Christians say when they refer to the Dominion Doctrine. Maybe it's a product of me being in the South, but when I've had these conversations with people who are in my area, it usually ends up boiling down to them saying that it's impossible for us to ruin the world because it's ours and God wouldn't let us do that. I kid you not, back when I was a fast food manager, I legitimately had somebody tell me that it would be impossible for us to engage in mutually assured destruction via nuclear war because God would stop the missiles, because it wouldn't be the time for the apocalypse yet.
But for me, what I'm seeing in the modern climate change movement, I think, is a worship of nature, kind of Romans 1:20, and that's occurred because, if you like, we've lost that Christian or creation foundation to society and culture, and the modern climate change moving is really almost a fulfillment of Romans 1:20.
Well, let's get into that. Romans 1:20 says that, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible quantities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So wait, because people aren't seeing God in nature, now they're worshipping nature? Is that what you're saying? Because that seems to be working very backwards from the idea. Once you no longer deify nature, now nature's being worshipped. I feel as though there's something in your message that's not being properly communicated.
Where it says we're not going to recognize, they don't recognize the creation or the creator from the creation, and they're instead kind of worshipping nature as a result. So man has been relegated and the creation itself has been promoted to the preeminent position.
Again, only if you are working with a very fast and loose definition of worship to the point where the word almost has no meaning.
So that's by way of introduction. I think that's a balanced view. But here's what people really want to know, and I'm going to throw at you today. Is the planet warming or not? What should people think?
It's a very difficult question to answer because there are a lot of sub-questions that people want to know about. But I think possibly the planet really is warming, climate is changing and has been changing. But there's a lot more to it than that.
You're right. There is. So, let's get into that.
Right. So if it is warming, is that something we should be alarmed about now? Because my understanding is we've only been keeping records for less than 100 years. So even from their own evolutionary perspective of a 4.5 billion year old Earth, you know, there have been, according to them, multiple ice ages in the past. We think there was only one just after the flood.
Based off of little to no evidence, you use this dichotomy, the creation perspective versus the evolutionary perspective. But you do understand that this is not creation versus evolution. That's a convenient straw man, but you can have a created Earth while still having evolution. There are old Earth creationists for this exact reason. And there's currently nothing wrong with there being a different perspective on that. That's because we still don't have a definitive answer for how life came to be. One working hypothesis is abiogenesis, but as opposed to evolution, which has been expressly observed, we haven't been able to construct a cohesive theory on abiogenesis. We just have multiple hypotheses. Because of this, I don't have much problem with old Earth creationism because it at least accepts most of the known science. Young Earth creationism, on the other hand, is science denialism. But again, the point is that the dichotomy is not between creation and evolution. The dichotomy is between an old and young Earth. Sorry for that bit of a rant, but I don't like that dishonest framing, because it's that framing that causes people to deny science. When science, as a method, has given us things like modern medicine based off of the theory of evolution, almost as if it works or something.
Why such a knee-jerk reaction now to it all? I mean, so you've said it probably is evidence it is warming, slightly, I understand. So the question is it man-made, and do we need to panic now?
Well, that's, again, two separate questions. I mean, how much has man to do with the warming? Because, as you say, there have been warming cycles that even evolutionists admit. So even more in human times, they've been acknowledged that there has been a medieval warm period and followed by the Little Ice Age, and maybe we are coming out naturally from the Little Ice Age, and it hasn't been too much to do with humans. But then carbon dioxide really is a greenhouse gas, but so is water vapor, so possibly humans have done something to make the planet warmer.
So a lot of non-answers so far. I do want to go ahead and say, though, that yes, he is right. Water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. It actually contributes to about 60% of the warming effect of the greenhouse effect. CO2, on the other hand, this is because water vapor also contributes to clouds, which directly interface with how much sunlight is allowed to penetrate down to the planet. CO2, conversely, seems to contribute to about 26% of greenhouse gases. However, just going off of these numbers can be incredibly misleading. This is because, while water vapor is the largest contributor to the Earth's greenhouse effect, it does not control the Earth's temperature. The water vapor itself is controlled by Earth's temperature. If there is no increase in carbon dioxide, then the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere does not change. So when you initially hear that water vapor is a greenhouse gas, and then you do some research and find that it is a larger contributor to the greenhouse effect, the initial thought is that water is more important, and that's something that would need to be dealt with. Water doesn't need to be dealt with, so by entailment, the CO2 doesn't need to be dealt with. However, again, water vapor may be a bigger greenhouse gas, but its temperature is controlled by the amount of CO2. This is because the CO2 itself directly has an influence on the Earth's temperature. It's like stabbing your hand with a knife and then saying that the only reason it hurt is because your hand was there and in the way. And if you didn't have a hand, then there wasn't a problem to begin with. While technically this is true, realistically it was the knife that caused all the problems, not your hand being in the way. Just like it's the CO2 causing the majority of the problems, not the water vapor that's conversely affected by it.
But is it something to panic over is another question.
So you and I both do a lot of speaking in churches, and what I find, I'm actually getting asked this question more and more, particularly in the current climate, pardon the pun, but when Christians come up and ask my opinion, I feel like they're asking loaded questions. They're really wanting me to say, tell me it's not happening. You know, tell me that's all a conspiracy type of thing. You know, what would be your response to that?
I often get this question as well, and even both of us got it back in Australia too. Unfortunately, some people have made it a political issue, so it's not surprising that some of our questioners also ask for political reasons because it's a reaction to the politics that have been going on about it already.
You say, unfortunately, people make it into a political issue, but I'm going to let you know right now, if the fossil fuel industry has its money in the pockets of politicians, and are also a massive contributor to the vast amount of CO2 that is pumped into the atmosphere, then unfortunately this is going to be a political issue for a very long time. Oh, and not to mention, when there is not some random millionaire philanthropist who's helping fund research, arguing with politicians is one of the only ways to get grants for research. So as much as I would love for science to be divorced from politics, and in an ideal world it would be, disentangling those two from each other is impossible in a world where money exists.
But there are things that we should bear in mind as Christians.
Yeah, I think we'd both agree, whether it's warming or not, whether there is change, it's been politicised. And it looks like we're going to have to live, certainly, with the consequences of that.
Again, the money's tied up. That's why you can't divorce those two.
So, you know, one of the reasons we wanted to do this is to make sure that as Christians, whenever we approach these topics, that we do so with wisdom. We're not anti-government. We're not, anti-big business. We are pro-Bible, and we have to use the Bible as a filter for interpreting this. Now, so one way, for example, is I like to point out to people 4,500 years ago, we had the world's greatest climate change event when the world was actually destroyed during a global flood. The continents we have today did not exist pre-flood. The environments we have today did not exist pre-flood.
When your argument requires you to completely ignore reality, that becomes the basis for me dismissing your argument. So, let's see if I actually have a reason to do that. The young Earth creationist Genesis flood geology. Where does this come from? Well, in 1961, Henry Morris and John Whitcomb published the Genesis Flood. This title laid out a rejection of what we would consider to be modern geology. It argued that instead, the biblical flood needed to be credited for all geological features in the world, including all fossils and their locations. Now, this is kind of awkward considering that we never find fossils that are in inappropriate strata laid down by predictions predicated on a old Earth hypothesis. It would seem that that alone completely throws the entire idea of Noah's flood as a global event 4,000 years ago out the window. What is one thing that we would expect from an instantaneous massive flood? Well, we would expect there to be at least one layer of rock to cover an entire continent from one end to the other. Any continent at all. This is something that you would expect from a global flood. At least one with the destructive properties laid out in Genesis. What do we find, though? Well, we find several rock layers that overlap one another in a way that is completely and totally depicted in plate tectonics, predicated on an old Earth hypothesis. Almost as if that model has predictive power, and therefore is more in line with reality. The scientific model has predictive power. We can predict what fossils and what rock layers should be found where in the world, and then we find those rock layers and fossils where we expect them to be. Under the Genesis flood model, we have ad hoc explanations for these things. No predictive power, unless we're talking about predictive power in the vaguest of senses that could also be the same predictive power we find in prophecies. You know, things like, there will be wars and there will be sickness, two things that have always existed as long as humans have had societies.
So 4,500 years later, we have fully thriving ecosystems all over the world. So within that, it looks like the Earth itself has some self-correcting ability and mechanisms.
Oh, no doubt, the Earth has ways of healing itself. But here's the thing. When we use your model, that again has no predictive power and relies solely on ad hoc explanations, we get an Earth that's shaped almost like a rubber band. It has the ability to instantly spring back from things as opposed to slowly having to fix itself. This would lead you to the conclusion that no one in any capacity can do enough damage to the world that it can't just auto-correct itself in a handful of generations. Individual ecosystems don't spring back that quickly, not without outside intervention, much less the entire freaking planet.
I think one of the problems is, we build a condo, brick and mortar condo, 6 foot from the waterline at the edge of Miami. And if the water raises 6 inches, we think it's Armageddon. A couple of 100 years ago, you probably picked up your tent and you moved it. I mean, would you say that that's one of the issues, that people think the climate does not change and that's a problem?
Before Sarfati gets to give us his explanations, I want to go ahead and point out that people have been building civilizations, permanent civilizations, alongside riverbanks, seacoasts, and the like for years. And they didn't live in just tents, they had permanent structures. These different civilizations also had floods. The issue here isn't just a handful of people who bought a condo near Miami and then suddenly decided that the apocalypse was coming. That has to be some of the most inane, asinine framing I've heard from somebody who touts himself to be right next to an expert. The fact is, we have examples like the snows of Kilimanjaro melting more than 80% within the last 100 years. We have glaciers melting so fast in the Himalayas that it's projected they could be virtually unrecognizable and disappear by 2035. Here's the thing though, sea levels will not rise uniformly everywhere on Earth, and in some select areas it may even drop slightly based on their particular climates. If you gain an inch of seawater in an area, but then there are tectonic shifts in the area that cause the floor to sink another inch, then at the end of the day, your sea level itself will not seem like it's risen, even though the over amount of water in volume has dramatically increased. This is why one of the ways that we measure things are not just through sea levels rising, but also through the melting of ice caps in different areas of the world. So it's not just a handful of people in Miami who are panicking about an apocalypse because their condos are getting sunk.
Well, you have to wonder, some of the biggest proponents that we got to do something right now are still building mansions near the oceans. You wonder how much they believe it themselves if they're building property near oceans themselves, which could be flooded if they were right in what they're claiming.
Or it could be that coastal mansions actually sell very high in the real estate market, so whether or not they believe in climate change has no bearing on whether or not it's actually happening or what the market demands. This is a non-argument. This gets us nowhere.
Okay, but the thing is, we have had a flood. That's a huge disturbance of the equilibrium. And you think about what happens if you push a pendulum far from equilibrium, it swings back, goes the other direction, and then it eventually slows down. This is called damped oscillation, and the Earth has gone through the flood, and followed by the flood there was an ice age, and then you have warming from that. So I just wonder if there's a very slow oscillation from that, and that's why we see the medieval warm periods and the little ice age, and maybe we're just coming into a warm cycle.
So, again, your entire hypothesis for why climate change is happening is that the Earth is naturally swinging a pendulum the opposite way from the global flood that you state had to have been 4,000 years ago. A claim that is not backed up by any of the geological evidence, any of the evidence on the coastlines we've been able to find, and is in fact refuted by every single bit of evidence we've found through tectonic plate observations. This means that your hypothesis is grounded entirely on a myth that you can bring no factual data to support. Because every bit of data you bring up will either be anecdotal and extrapolated far past the scope of its actual use, or has already been refuted by actual science.
Right. So would you say what we have to be careful of Christians is also having a knee-jerk reaction, an anti-reaction, but by the same token, the secular community is having a knee-jerk reaction, and I would think that because we haven't been measuring and watching long enough in this modern era, we have time. We don't take a stand actually as a ministry on this, but as I said, I think we can agree that it's been politicized. One of the issues I will speak up about that I have a problem with is the language that's being used in the secular realm. Using little girls as propaganda and as tools to promote certain things, I find stomach churning, to be honest.
Oh boy, we're going to be talking about Greta right now. So you do understand that for years, like literal decades, actual scientists and good science communicators have been trying to give you the facts for years by appealing to your logic, by appealing to your notions. Why is it any wonder to anyone on this planet anymore that an appeal to emotion was one of the last-ditch efforts? How is anyone surprised that when facts, logic, and data didn't work on you, they used your emotions? It's like having a racist grandpa who won't change his ways until he comes to terms with the fact that his daughter married a black guy and he's going to have a mixed child. Giving him all the facts about how phrenology is bullshit and how he's no better than anybody because he's white wasn't going to change his opinion. But having to look his grandchild in the face and come to terms with the fact that he does in fact love that grandchild can be the thing that makes all the difference. And I'm sorry if I sound like I'm being heated, but I am so tired of hearing everybody complain about using a child for a political message, when historically, facts, data, and hard evidence did not convince people. So they stopped going for the brain and started going for the heart. If you want to say that it's repulsive, fine, go ahead, but the last thing you should be is surprised. Especially while you're being so stubborn and taking a blatantly anti-science stance, literally proving the point about why putting a child on the global stage was an ultimately effective thing to do.
And they use words like extinction level event occurring. Now that's alarmist, and particularly with our young people, they're concerned there's not going to be anything here for them in the future. I mean, if you put yourself in their shoes, you could understand that, right?
Except that they believe that a century from now, the average temperature might be a degree warmer than it is today, which is hardly catastrophic. And I think young people need to realize that they've never had it so good as far as general health and welfare. And it's thanks to the fossil fuels, the energy revolution, and the electronics revolution. I mean, speed of transport, speed of communication. See, these people wouldn't have the communication they have if it wasn't for the industry they hate so much.
Okay, so maybe we need to go ahead and frame this so that people like you can understand it. You're trying to claim that they're angry at these industries, and they are, but they're not angry at the good things that come from these industries. They're angry at the negative effects. I can be entirely thankful to have been born and raised in the United States and giving me the individual perspective that it has, while also condemning the actions of my Puritan forefathers who slaughtered indigenous people to get us here, who engaged in religious bigotry for the purpose of moving us here, while still being thankful that ultimately I am here. This is the logic that people have used to say that the slave trade was a good thing because it meant that black people could be here in the United States. There is nuance to this. You can point out that there have been negative effects and negative consequences to the fossil fuel industry while still pointing out that the internal combustion engine was a good thing. But here's the other thing. The industries that people are upset about, which I can speak from my perspective, not anybody else's, the issue is how reliant we are on fossil fuel still. There is a limited amount of fossil fuel in the world. Even if climate change weren't happening, there would be incentive for us to move away from fossil fuel so that we could conserve what we still have of it. Moving to sustainable forms of energy where we can, and accepting fossil fuels where we can't, is a move forward, as opposed to just bending the knee to the fossil fuel industry wholesale because, oh, look at all the good things it's given us. This seems to be basically an argument to dismiss the perspective of young people, regardless of whether or not they're bringing any factual evidence to the table. Moreover, I find it incredibly hypocritical that you basically talk about the advances science has given us in things like medicine, while also being anti-evolution and the scientific method. And no, I'm not engaging in whataboutism right now, because I'm not basing the truth value of their statements on this particular deflection. This is why I went over why their method is wrong first, and then deflected the issue back at them.
Yeah, and modern medicines and things like that save millions of lives.
Well, people aren't dying in childhood from horrible diseases like they used to, you see. So how are we sealing their futures? Because of the industry they hate so much that they have a future in the first place, that they exist in the first place. So I think it's a huge imbalance there. We should be thankful for the progress made by science.
We should, but remember the argument I made about how you could use this type of logic without any nuance to get to the conclusion that people should be happy for slavery because it means that they could be born in the United States? That is a dumb take, and it's what happens when you take this particular methodology and try to use it to justify literally anything. It's like, if my dad were an abusive father, I should be thankful he was abusive because it's that abuse that led him to assaulting my mother, which led to my birth. Now, this isn't the history of how I was born, but it is how many people are born in the United States, unfortunately. And when you take this logic and apply it anywhere, you get absurd statements like, I should be thankful my father was abusive.
And just also be careful that we don't go too far.
So Jono, here's the issue. As Christians then, let me say, not just Christians, what as humanity do you think we should be doing about it?
Well, the point is the cure can't be worse than the disease, because since fossil fuels have been responsible for the energy revolution that's made our society as prosperous as it is, if we get rid of fossil fuels, we may impoverish more people, especially in Africa, where they're trying to come out of poverty. If we say you can't build coal stations, we may be condemning them to poverty, and poverty is an enormous health hazard, far more than 1 degree of warming a century from now.
So, first of all, like I said before, you can, in fact, take the stance that areas that do not need fossil fuel energy can convert away from it, convert to nuclear, and then work on sustainable forms after the fact. It's not a fast process, but I'd argue it's a necessary one. However, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which includes more than 1,300 scientists from the United States and other countries, forecast a temperature rise of 2.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the next century. Now, you didn't say if you're using Celsius or Fahrenheit. I'm going to assume Fahrenheit. Even if it's Celsius, you're still wrong based on the high-end number. This means that not only is your framing of your opponent a straw man, but your argument about the impact of climate change is also a straw man. You're arguing only with the low-end numbers, and that's only if I grant that you're arguing in Celsius.
So I want to just, in closing, talk about one other thing, and I alluded to it at the beginning, and that's an irony that I see. Mm-hmm. So when I say the secular community, let's say that these are not pro-Bible people. They don't believe the Bible's history.
Yeah.
And so they would say, well, the Earth's 4.5 billion years old. You and I are nothing more than evolved apes. And as I said, there's been multiple ice ages. There's been different climates on the Earth in which the dinosaurs thrived. There was a mass extinction event when the giant asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs along with millions of other species.
I swear if I have to hear Sarfati go, or another time, I'm going to ram my head through a wall.
Isn't there an irony there that if human beings have evolved to the top of the food chain, don't we deserve our place here anyway?
This is the same kind of argument that people use to say that if you were in a godless world, then there'd be no repercussions for your actions, and therefore you should be allowed to murder, steal, etc. You can take many different stances from the idea that humans have gotten to where we are as the, quote, top of the food chain. You can take the argument that it's our responsibility to take care of the Earth since we have the equal capacity to destroy it. You could argue that it's a good idea to take care of the Earth because it's the only place we currently can inhabit. And part of being at the top of the food chain isn't exhausting all the resources around you. You can only stay on top of the food chain as long as your species is allowed to exist. Saying that from an evolutionist point of view, shouldn't you be allowed to dominate the Earth and destroy it, is not only a straw man, but it's an idiotic take.
So why have we relegated human beings to, to be less than the planet that we rose to the top of, in a sense?
Yeah, we evolved because we're the fittest, we survived, and therefore why should we help our competitors under an evolutionary worldview? We're just the fittest and the others, well, too bad for them.
You're either unfathomably ignorant or unfathomably stupid. Ignorant in that you either don't understand what evolution is, or stupid in that you understand what it is and you still get it just that wrong. The top of the food chain is nothing more than a category that we have put ourselves in arbitrarily. No meaning is actually granted to anybody by being at the top of the food chain as long as we're the ones writing what that food chain is. Secondly, survival of the fittest does not mean that we're the fittest, that means we're the baddest, we can exploit all the people around us. It means that we were lucky enough to be the ones that adapted to our environment the best. Now, can you please tell me, in no uncertain terms, what happens when you've adapted to an environment and then you fundamentally change that environment to where it's uninhabitable by you? It is almost as if, based on even your straw man of survival of the fittest, that we should keep the environment as close to habitable for us as possible, because by fundamentally changing that environment, we change the environment that birthed us in the first place. We rose to the top in this environment. Again, in your straw man. This means that by fundamentally changing that environment, we can fundamentally change our place on the food chain. And that's if I grant your gross misrepresentation of a theory.
Things are becoming extinct all the time. Well, so what? That's part of nature. Why should we care? It's only the Christian worldview that actually gives us a reason to care, because God gave us dominion. He expects us to use this dominion in a benevolent way for our benefit, but not to rape the environment. I mean, the worst environmental disasters were in atheistic communist countries.
Yeah, and they're still suffering from it today in places like China and the Soviet Union, where they're still cleaning up the messes.
You just had to get that jab in there. Oh, look, the worst things happened in the communist countries who are also non-Christian. As if the economic status of those countries had anything to do with the disasters themselves, or the religious state of any of those areas had to do with the disasters. This is just a bunch of category errors, all in a single claim. And then you get to keep that smug little grin when you're done. And also, can I just say that if you want to argue that the Dominion means that we should be good stewards of the Earth, there's just as many Christian perspectives that argue that we should be allowed to exploit the Earth, because we could never exploit it to the point where it's uninhabitable, because, well, apocalypse, revelation, Jesus, all that fun stuff. This is why the phrase, the Christian perspective, is comical nonsense. There are as many Christian perspectives, at least, as there are denominations, likely as many as there are churches, but realistically as many as there are Christians.
Yeah, because again, why should they, under their atheistic communist system, care about the environment? Only the Christians should care.
Okay, that's enough of that video. But there's no correlation between atheism and communism. Communism is about a classless, stateless society. Atheism has no bearing on that, nor does Christianity. You can have a stateless, classless society where the only hierarchy that's noted at all is the one where Jesus is on top and you get to be the power bottom. If that's what you want to do, then by all means, I don't care. But I feel as though you should have called something socialist or liberal in there as well, because, well, again, this is just verbal propaganda at this point. And I don't want to repeat all the reasons why they're wrong to say the atheistic worldview, the Christian worldview, atheists should be the exploiters, Christians shouldn't, etc., etc. I think I've made the point pretty clear by now, but I'll go ahead and add one more thing here anyways. From an atheist point of view, If there is only one life, which atheism doesn't even entail a view on the afterlife, but let's pretend it does, then I would owe it to everyone around me to try to enrich their lives, so they would have the ability to enrich mine or my future generations. Being a good steward of the planet is one way of doing that. After all, if I want my kids to live an enriching life and therefore be able to enrich mine as well, I would need to make sure that they can at least be happy on the planet they're on. But that's an individual's perspective, not a perspective from atheism's point of view, because there is no such thing. But anyways, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, share it with your friends, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the notification icon so that the algorithm gods can look at me in their good graces. Also, as I alluded to in the beginning of the video, today's episode was recorded on a different microphone, the Fifine K780A. If you need a good budget microphone, and all the equipment to come with it as well, then I have a link in the description for you guys to follow. And maybe in some alternative parallel universe, I'll actually get paid for this plug, over and above the mic provided. Meanwhile, in reality, if you want to support me on a monthly basis, then the best way to do that is through Patreon. Though, if you want to support me one time, then my PayPal's in the description. I want to thank you all for watching, and as always everyone, insert end of video tagline here.